Question. Hi Kim, I'm hoping to get a deeper understanding of what it means to let a separate self die. Currently, my understanding is that decrees and invocations are used to clear my energy field in various ways, depending on which ascended master I'm calling. It is, however, up to me to become aware of the separate selves within my four lower bodies and let them die. This is where I get stuck, or maybe I'm not willing to accept what it takes to do this. I've heard you mention therapy and personal reflection. I'm also aware that this can take some time, years or even lifetimes. Sometimes it seems that, even though I can see my behavior, thinking and emotional responses as coming from a separate self, I can't do anything to stop it from showing up. This can be frustrating and confusing, as I'm sure you know. I imagine some separate selves fall away easier than others, and sometimes it takes more direct action, like lifestyle changes or therapy. I would greatly appreciate any insight you can give on this topic. My intuition tells me that there's more to understand. Yeah, there is more to understand, but it's not all going to be understanding. It is also a matter of practice. Let me just describe a situation that I went through. I have mentioned this before, but I think it's a good way to describe it. So, all of my life, even when I look back at my childhood, I've always been very aware of the abuse of power. I could see world leaders, how they had abused power, and I always felt it was really, really bad. It shouldn't happen. It was the cause of so many atrocities when you look at history. So then when I found my first spiritual movement, Transcendental Meditation, I obviously felt that in a spiritual movement, there really shouldn't be abuse of power. And then I saw some abuses of power in the TM movement, not really that bad, but I saw some. And I spoke out about it. But I didn't really get into any major conflicts there. But then after that, I found the Summit Lighthouse. I traveled to the United States. I became part of the staff that worked in Montana, their headquarters. And I ended up having a conflict with a supervisor in the department where I worked because I felt that he was abusing power. And this time I spoke out in a more direct way, partly because I felt this is an Ascended Master organization. It really shouldn't be happening here, of all places. And it came to the attention of Elizabeth Care Prophet, who was the leader of the Summit Lighthouse. And she challenged me on it. She challenged me, my ego. And up until then, you understand, I had felt perfectly justified in doing what I was doing and saying what I was saying. I'd been perfectly justified in this because I felt, oh, this shouldn't be happening. It's costing the community money because we're doing inefficient procedures and the supervisor won't recognize this and so forth and so on. So I had all these arguments. And when she challenged me on it, I just sensed, it was like I sensed she could see something in my ego that I couldn't see myself. And I just decided I'm going to stop defending myself. I'm not going to try and explain this away or defend it. She wanted a reaction from me, what I thought about what she said. And I just decided, so basically you could say, she gave me an opportunity to defend myself. And based on my previous behavior in this lifetime and probably many lifetimes, that was what I typically would have done. But I just decided not to defend myself and decide, I'm not going to worry about the other people, how they react to the situation. I'm going to look at what do I need to see, what do I need to overcome. So, why am I bringing this up? Well, because it shows you the dynamic that you're not seeing a self while you're in it. We have talked about there's the conscious you, which is pure awareness, which means it's not the outer personality. The conscious you is not a separate self. right? It's not a separate self. It has created the separate self. It has gone into it and it has experienced the world and itself through that separate self, possibly for many lifetimes. I have no doubt that I have spent many lifetimes objecting to the abuse of power. But it was still, and I'm not saying it's wrong to, this is the tricky part, it's not necessarily wrong to object to the abuse of power, but the way I was doing it was with an emotional charge that came from a subconscious self. So, what I'm saying is, the conscious you cannot see the self. It cannot see that there's anything wrong with it. This is the way you have to do it. I mean, abuse of power is wrong. Somebody has to object to it. I have to object to it. That was what I felt. And in a sense, I can look back and say, maybe there was a certain awareness in me that I had a certain emotional energy that wasn't pure, but I still felt it was justified because this had to be corrected. So what I'm saying is, when the conscious you is inside the separate self, you can't see the self. You can't see there's anything wrong with it. But because the conscious you hasn't become the self, we always have the potential to shift outside. The question is, what makes us even think that it could be necessary to shift? And so the reason why I'm bringing up this situation was that this was a pretty extreme situation for me. It was sort of a high-risk situation because I really wanted to be a good student of the Ascended Masters. I want to fit into the community. So starting to criticize somebody was really taking a risk. And now it seemed like Elizabeth Care Prophet had called my ego, which made it even more high risk because obviously I didn't want her to see my ego, as most people in the Summit Lighthouse didn't want. And so it was a very high-risk situation, and because of that, something shifted. So my conscious you said, let me just look at myself here. And that's the process we all have to go through to come to see a separate self. And the question is, what is the trigger that triggers us into coming to the point where we're willing to look at ourselves? And for me, it had to be a pretty high-risk, extreme situation. I'm not saying it's the most extreme situation, but for me it was. If you understand my mentality, I wanted to be a good student. I wanted to be seen like I was doing all the right things. And so I didn't want to expose publicly that I had some kind of ego. So it was a high-risk situation for me, and probably that's why I shifted. And so what I'm saying is, we all have a certain, let's say we have a specific self. So the question is, the only way to overcome it is to come to a point where we're willing to look. And we all have a trigger point that causes us to be willing to look. So really, it is a matter of saying, when you realize the whole dynamic with the subconscious selves, a matter of saying, what is my trigger point? Do I have to wait for some extreme outer situation before I'm sort of forced to look at this self? Or can I shift my attitude so that I am deciding to look at the self without going through an extreme situation? You see, I honestly look back at myself and I could see that I was absolutely meant to do what I did in that situation. And I've actually never had any regrets about it. I never look back and say, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Then I would have still seemed like a good student. Because I realized if I hadn't done it, I wouldn't have been in that trigger situation to look at myself. And therefore, I wouldn't have made the progress I made. I wouldn't have gotten over this subconscious self. And since then, because of that, I have, of course, shifted to where I'm not saying it doesn't happen that there's an outer situation that triggers me to look at a subconscious self, but in most cases, I'm just looking at it inside because I'm always watching my reaction. Do I have any attachment? Do I have a certain reaction to this or that, for example? And so I'm just observing myself. Now, the thing is, I mean, what is the person saying here? That it's like we all have resistance to seeing these selves. We all have resistance. In other words, the selves are resisting being exposed. And so what I found was there came a certain point where my resistance drastically was reduced. And it was reduced because I went through a shift, and it took some time. It involved going into therapy, but it was not really the therapy. Well, it was partly the therapy that helped it, but it was really, there came a point where I experienced that God's love for me, the Ascended Master's love for me, my higher self's love for me, is unconditional. I experienced that unconditional love. But in order to be able to experience it, I had to overcome some subconscious selves. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's kind of a catch-22 here. Because if you look back at this situation I'm describing at the Summit Lighthouse, this took place in 1988. At that time, I had great resistance to having my subconscious selves exposed because I felt I wanted to be a good Ascended Master student. As a good Ascended Master student, you don't have ego. You're not acting from the ego. So I resisted having my ego exposed, which is a very common response. I've seen it in other spiritual movements. You know, we want to seem like a good student. We don't want to have our ego exposed, so we try to hide it, right? And of course, this makes absolutely no sense. What does it mean to be a good Ascended Master student? It means you're overcoming the ego. And it doesn't mean that you have no ego, right? This is what happens in spiritual movements. It's very, very dysfunctional. You think the popular culture is, the moment you walk through the door, your ego just fell away. And now, because you're in this wonderful, elevated teaching, you're ego-free. You could probably find 50 spiritual movements out there that have this kind of culture. Maybe only 49, but you still get the point. So, what I'm saying is, there came a point where I saw this dynamic in myself. I saw it. I saw that I had the resistance. And I realized it doesn't make any sense because spiritual progress means overcoming the psychology. And if I had no unresolved psychology, why would I need the teaching? Right? It's like I'm a student on the path. I am making progress. Right? What does it mean to make progress? It doesn't mean sitting there doing 3 hours of violet flame decrees a day to transmute your karma. No, it means looking at your psychology and overcoming the hang-ups you have. I just realized how the resistance to looking was completely illogical. I mean, it was cognitive dissonance. I want to make progress on the spiritual path, but I don't want to look at my psychology. Hello, the only way to make progress on the spiritual path is to look at your psychology. Stupid. So I just realized it was dysfunctional, my whole approach. But what helped me make that shift was that I realized that even though other people might judge and condemn me for having some unresolved psychology, the Ascended Masters didn't. And this is actually what I experienced in that situation I'm talking about, because after I had decided that I was going to look at myself, I sat down, meditated on this, and all of a sudden I felt the presence of the Ascended Master El Moya, who is now Master Moore, and it was the most pink, loving, unconditional love I'd ever felt. And I realized this is what the Ascended Masters always feel for us. It's just that I couldn't accept it before, but now I had experienced it. And that was really also what helped me make the shift. It took some years to make the shift I'm talking about, but it was really what helped me make that shift to realize that the Masters don't judge me the way other people judge me or the way I judge myself. The Masters just want me to make progress. They just want me to see the separate self and overcome it. And that made it easier for me to come to the point where I could say, okay, I am willing to see what is in my psychology without having it exposed in some outer situation. I'm willing to look, and I'm willing to have the masters expose this to me. And since then, first of all, I'm monitoring myself. When I see a reaction, I'm always calling to the masters, help me see this more clearly. And over time, this has sort of, and I know this is not comforting for people, but over time this has built a certain momentum where it's become easier for me. And, you know, as the person is saying, sometimes it takes time. I don't think it necessarily takes lifetimes to resolve a subconscious self, but it can certainly take years. I've had subconscious selves that it took me a long time to overcome. But this doesn't mean that you can't make progress in a shorter term, because I've also had subconscious selves that are very easy to overcome. Because, you know, what you have to realize here is, you have to realize right now, your psychology is in a certain way. You have a certain amount of these subconscious selves in your subconscious mind. And part of those subconscious selves are in your identity body, which means your sense of identity in this world, your sense of outer identity, is based on some of these subconscious selves. If they were removed all at once, you would have an instant identity crisis. You wouldn't know who you are, which is what you see happening to some people when they have a dramatic mystical experience. And so what you are really doing on the spiritual path is you're going through a fundamental, you might say existential shift in identity. And you can't do it all at once, right? So we have to be very careful that we don't create this unrealistic expectation that many people have, that, oh, it should happen very quickly. Like the non-dual teachers and neo-advisor, oh, you can just shift your mind and you're instantly awakened. It's just not realistic. But on the other hand, we also have to realize that the ego will take advantage of this realization to try and drag it out indefinitely, so we never get over it. So there's again a balance to be found. And but for me, the greatest shift was that I came to realize there is the opposition to looking. And when I consciously looked at the opposition and dealt with that, and came to the point where I was willing to look, then it became much easier to see the selves. And the reason why I'm saying it takes time to resolve selves is that, as I said, we can't see it all at once. We have to, in order to resolve a self, the conscious you has to first shift outside the self. And this can happen in difficult situations, conflict situations, for example, like the situation I described. My conscious you shifted outside the self. But then you have to consciously come to see that the self is based on an illusion. And the illusion that I saw in the situation I'm describing is actually very profound, because you could say, but abuse of power is wrong. And especially in the spiritual movement, there shouldn't be the abuse of power. So it was perfectly right for me to speak out about this. Yes, but I didn't speak out about it from a neutral, loving state of mind. I had a condemning state of mind. And it was partly because I came to the Summit Lighthouse. I felt I was special when I was in Denmark, traveling over there. And then when I came over there, there were 600 other people who also had traveled from their own places, and they all felt special. And so nobody, all of a sudden, I wasn't special anymore. And I felt I was ignored and I wasn't given the attention. My ego felt it wasn't given the attention I was due. And so I partly spoke out to say, oh, here I am. See how important I am. See what I can do. I can do for this community, because I can see what others can't see. So it was an ego, part of it was ego-based. You can say, it wasn't totally wrong what I did, but the way I did it, the attitude I did it with. So what I actually realized from this is, you can actually do the right thing, but you're doing it with the wrong vibration, the wrong energy behind it, a fear-based, pride-based energy. And this has helped me come to see these subconscious selves much better, where I've become more sensitive to reading the energy behind a subconscious self. And whenever I see some energy in my, when I sense some energy that isn't neutral, I know there's something hiding there. So yeah, I mean, what's the real conclusion here? Sometimes it seems that even though I can see my behavior, thinking, and emotional responses as coming from a separate self, I can't do anything to stop it from showing up. This can be frustrating and confusing, as I'm sure you know. Yes, I definitely know that. But the thing is, it's again the two phases. The conscious you can step outside. Let's put it another way. Let's put it this way. When the conscious you is inside a separate self, it's colored by the self. Therefore, it's not aware of the self. It's not aware of what the self is doing. It's not really aware of the consequences. So there can come a point where you have, the conscious you has stepped enough outside the self that it's aware that there's something there. There's a pattern of behavior, there's a reactionary pattern that isn't harmonious. I've used the example before that the Buddha talked about non-attachment. So I realized at a certain point when I have any kind of attachment, there's something unresolved. There's basically a subconscious self hiding behind it. So you can come to see that. But you haven't done the second phase that I talked about. You haven't seen the illusion that the self is based on. And again, to go back to the situation I described, basically my subconscious self was based on the illusion that the ends can justify the means. I mean, the goal here was to make the Summit Lighthouse function better and not waste money on unnecessary practices. And this was so important of a goal that it just justified that I had some ego and that I was not harmonious about it. You see, I hadn't seen that. I hadn't seen that pursuing a right goal with a wrong energy vibration is not justified. It's not Christ-like behavior. It's ego-based behavior. And I hadn't been willing to see that. And so what I'm saying is, when you feel that you're stuck there, it's because you have seen that there's a self there. You have seen there's some unresolved psychology, but you haven't looked deep enough to see what's the belief that you have. What is it you're believing? That, because you could say, why is it frustrating? I can't do anything to stop it from showing up. Why not? Because you haven't seen it yet for what it is. You haven't seen the belief that makes it seem necessary or justified what the self is doing. You see? And that, so you have to work towards that shift. You have to start observing yourself, asking questions. What is the self telling me about my behavior, specific situations, or about the world? What is the reasoning of the self based on? There's some belief incorporated in the self, like in my case, that the outer result is so important that pursuing it with the wrong vibration is justified. Well, complete illusion, right? So I'm just mentioning this as one example. There can of course be many others. But if you keep looking at it, keep peeling away these layers, you would say, you'll come to the point where you see it. You see that it's just an illusion, and it just keeps you trapped. It keeps you trapped in this sort of no man's land where you know there's something, but you can't overcome it. It keeps coming back. And essentially I'm reminded of, in the Summit Lighthouse, there was this girl once, we had some discussion about violet flame, and she was talking about her psychology, and she had something in her psychology, and whenever she talked to somebody about it, they would always say, oh, put it in the violet flame. And she said, and I do, but it keeps coming back. And that's exactly it, because decreeing to transmute it isn't going to work. You need to see it consciously. You need to see that illusion. Now, the decrees can help. It can transform the energy that blocks you from seeing the illusion. But it isn't going to go away until you really see it. You really have to see it. So as long as you have a sense there's something there and it keeps coming back and you're frustrated about it, try and step back. Try and look at it from a different angle. And yes, therapy can certainly help. You get your different perspective on it. But sometimes just talking to other people about it or reading a book about it can help you. I have all of my life studied psychology, and sometimes you read something and all of a sudden it shifts. Oh, now I see this self that I have. So I know I could probably go on, but I hope this helps to some degree, and if not, then ask me some more questions about it, because I realize this is not an easy topic, and I realize that sometimes, because I have been doing it for so long, I kind of forget how it was to get started on it. So I hope that people will ask me more specific questions about it, and hopefully I can then come up with some answer that will help you.